George Harrison was called the quiet Beatle. To the world he seemed calm, soft-spoken, even distant at times. But behind that silence, there was a storm building, a quiet bitterness that never fully healed. For years, Harrison carried wounds that weren't visible on stage, but were carved deep inside him. He wasn't just overshadowed by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. He was undermined, second-guessed, and often dismissed. And while George rarely raised his voice, he left behind subtle signs that revealed just how deeply he resented the way he was treated. This is the story of the Beatle who refused to be silenced. A man who transformed his frustration into some of the most powerful music of his career, and whose quiet rebellion changed the band forever. In the late 1950s, George Harrison was just a kid riding the school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. Paul was older, sharper, and already brimming with confidence. George, still a quiet teenager, was drawn to that energy. Through Paul, he met John Lennon, and soon his life changed forever. When George auditioned for Lennon's band, the choirman John thought he was too young. But George's persistence paid off. On a second chance, he stunned Lennon by playing the tricky lead guitar part to Raunchy. And just like that, the 15-year-old had secured a place in what would eventually become the most famous band in history. But from the very beginning, George was stepping into someone else's world. Lennon and McCartney already dominated the vision, the songwriting, and the direction. George was the youngest, the quiet one, the student learning from the masters. For a while that was enough. He admired them, absorbed their ideas, and followed their lead. What he didn't know was that this dynamic, the brilliant duo in control, with George left on the margins, would shape not just the band's music, but the resentment he carried for the rest of his life. As the Beatles rocketed to global fame, George Harrison earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle. To the press, it was a neat way of labeling his shy, introspective nature. But to those closest to him, quiet didn't mean content. It meant silenced. Inside the studio, Lennon and McCartney were the driving force. They wrote the songs. They set the vision. George, despite growing as a musician, was often treated as an afterthought. His ideas were questioned, his contributions minimized. Paul, especially, with his perfectionist streak, had a way of stepping in, correcting, and ultimately taking control. Harrison later admitted that years of working under Paul's shadow left scars, even confessing, "He ruined me as a guitar player." Not maliciously, but from years of being subtly undermined. What started as admiration for Lennon's brilliance and McCartney's confidence slowly began to twist into resentment. George wanted space to breathe, to grow, to have his music taken seriously. Instead, he found himself boxed into the role of the junior partner no matter how much he evolved as an artist. And by the mid-1960s, the Quiet Beatle wasn't just quietly frustrated anymore. He was quietly angry. By the late 1960s, George Harrison was no longer the shy kid tagging along behind John and Paul. He had matured into a songwriter with a voice of his own. Songs like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" proved he could create music as powerful as anything his bandmates wrote. But inside the studio it was a different story. During the making of the White Album in 1968, the cracks widened. Paul McCartney, now acting like the group's de facto leader, pushed his vision relentlessly. John Lennon, distracted and erratic, drifted in and out. And George, he was done being ignored. He wanted his music to matter. He wanted his voice to be heard. Things boiled over in January 1969 during the filming of Let It Be. Cameras captured one of the most telling moments in Beatles history. Paul was instructing George on how to play a guitar part for Two of Us. Frustrated and exhausted, George fired back calmly but sharply. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It wasn't sarcasm. It was surrender, a quiet plea that spoke louder than shouting ever could. Days later, Harrison walked out. On January 10, 1969, he quit the Beatles. To the public, it looked like a band rehearsal gone wrong. But to George, it was years of suffocation finally exploding. Though he returned under new terms, something had broken. From that point on, George wasn't just in a band, he was preparing to break free from it. When George returned to the Beatles after briefly quitting, the damage was already done. The bond between him and Paul had thinned to a fragile thread, and his trust in the band's creative balance was gone. But instead of collapsing, George turned that frustration into fuel. Just months after the Beatles broke up in 1970, Harisson released his first major solo record, All Things Must Pass. It wasn't just an album, it was a revelation. The songs that John and Paul had brushed aside in Beatles sessions suddenly had room to breathe, and they poured out in a massive triple album that critics hailed as a masterpiece. Tracks like My Sweet Lord revealed his spiritual depth, while Isn't It a Pity exposed years of buried pain. But perhaps the sharpest dagger was Wah Wah. On the surface it sounded upbeat, but its lyrics dripped with bitterness. To many it was George's coded attack on McCartney, his way of mocking the constant noise and control he had endured in the band. And the blows kept coming. In 1973, Harisson released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, a biting track about the ugly legal battles that followed the Beatles' split. While it was aimed at the group as a whole, fans knew exactly who he was pointing at: Paul, who had initiated the lawsuit to dissolve their partnership. For George, it wasn't just business, it felt like betrayal. The resentment that had once stayed hidden, hid his quiet exterior, was now written into his music for the world to hear. But the feud with Paul wasn't the only scar. Another wound, this time from John Lennon, cut even deeper. Even after the Beatles ended, George's feelings toward Paul never really softened. To the public, their relationship looked civil. They smiled in interviews, posed for reunion photos, and even worked together briefly. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. George's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later revealed that he often came home from sessions furious, drained from constant clashes with Paul. She put it simply, they tolerated each other, but I don't think they ever really loved each other. That tension never truly went away. When the surviving Beatles reunited in the 1990s for the Anthology project, fans celebrated the moment as history being healed, but insiders saw something else. The same old dynamic returned almost instantly. George rolled his eyes at Paul's directions. Paul pushed too hard. George pushed back quietly, asked how it felt to be in the studio with McCartney again. Harisson didn't sugarcoat it. It was like going back to school. Even decades after the breakup, the bitterness lingered. Paul, ever the diplomat, admitted they got on each other's nerves. But George's resentment ran deeper. He once said openly that he'd happily form a band with John Lennon again, but never with Paul. It wasn't hatred. It was exhaustion. To George, Paul was brilliant, but overpowering. A friend and bandmate who had also been his biggest source of frustration, and unlike the music they made together, this tension never found harmony. But Paul wasn't the only one George carried scars from. Another relationship, the one he once valued most, would leave an even deeper wound. If Paul represented control and suffocation for George, John Lennon represented something even more complicated. In the early years, George idolized him. John was older, sharper, fearless, the kind of figure a quiet teenager could look up to. Lennon pushed him to grow as a musician, even encouraged his early attempts at songwriting. To George, John wasn't just a bandmate, he was a mentor. But as the years passed, that closeness faded into something far colder. John's attention drifted toward his own world, his activism, his art, his relationship with Yoko Ono. And in the process, George felt shut out. Worse, Lennon often mocked what mattered most to him. George's deepening interest in Indian music and spirituality wasn't met with support, but with sarcasm. Where George saw peace and meaning, John saw something to tease. The silence between them grew louder. In his 1980 memoir I, Me, Mine, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Over 400 pages, and John's name appeared just a handful of times. Fans noticed it wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate, a quiet statement that spoke volumes about the distance between them. Then, In December of that same year, Lennon was murdered outside his New York apartment. The news shattered George. But not in a way the public expected. His grief was real. But it wasn't simple. His tribute song all those years ago wasn't drenched in nostalgia or sentimentality. It was layered, part remembrance, part reckoning, a reminder of the bond they once shared, but also of the pain that had never gone away. For George, Lennon was both the man who had lifted him up and the man who made him feel invisible. A wound that never truly closed, even as the years went by. By the 1990s, George Harrison had long stepped out of the Beatles' shadow. He was no longer the teenager fighting to be heard in the studio. He had carved out a respected solo career, formed the Traveling Wilburys, and lived quietly at his beloved Friar Park estate. To the outside world, George had found peace. But deep down, the scars of his Beatles years never really faded. He rarely brought up the band unless asked, and when he did, his answers were dry, sometimes laced with irony. Asked in one interview if he missed being in the Beatles, he didn't hesitate. Not with the others, no. It was a joke, but it was also the truth. In 1997, Harisson was diagnosed with throat cancer. He battled through treatment, and though he briefly went into remission, the illness returned, spreading to his lungs and brain. As his health declined, he kept his wit and sharpness. In one of his last public appearances, a 2001 online Q&A, someone asked if Paul still annoyed him. George didn't answer directly. Instead, he quoted an old proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was clever, graceful, but unmistakably pointed. In his final months, Paul visited George at his home. The meeting was quiet, stripped of all the years of noise between them. They sat together, holding hands, something they would never have done in their youth. Paul later called him "my baby brother." They laughed, reminisced, and for a brief moment, the bitterness that had haunted them for decades seemed to soften. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away in Los Angeles, surrounded by family. His final words, according to his wife Olivia, were simple but profound: "Love one another." And yet, even in death, the question lingered. Did George and Paul ever truly make peace? Or were those old wounds only bandaged, never healed? George Harrison's legacy is unlike any of the other Beatles. He wasn't the loudest voice, and he wasn't the dominant songwriter, but his quiet rebellion spoke louder than most fans ever realized. He carried wounds from Paul's perfectionism, from John's indifference, and from years of being overlooked. Those wounds shaped him, hardened him, and eventually pushed him to create some of the most timeless music of his career. Even in his final years, Harrison refused to romanticize the past. He didn't pretend the Beatles were a perfect brotherhood. He told the truth, his truth, and that truth revealed that sometimes, even among legends, resentment lingers long after the music stops. Yes, George and Paul shared a final moment of tenderness before he passed. But whether that moment erased decades of frustration, that's something we'll never know. So the question remains, did the quiet Beatle ever truly forgive? Or was silence his only answer? What do you think? Did George and Paul ever find peace before the end? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed uncovering this side of Beatles history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold stories.